When we think of the Vatican today, we imagine a place of holiness and authority, a city of marble domes and sacred rituals, where the Pope stands as a symbol of faith for millions around the world. But in the Middle Ages, the Vatican was not only a spiritual center, it was also a battlefield of power, ambition, and hidden vice. Behind the walls of Rome, where prayers were said to ascend to heaven, shadows gathered. The Middle Ages were centuries of turbulence. Wars raged, plagues spread, kingdoms rose and fell. In this world, the Vatican was not untouched by corruption. It was often at the heart of it. Here, cardinals whispered in secret chambers, forging alliances not for God but for gold. Popes claimed to be shepherds of souls, yet some lived like kings, feasting in luxury, keeping mistresses, or waging wars in Christ's name. The sacred halls where holy relics were displayed also concealed bribes, betrayals, and forbidden desires. For ordinary Christians, the Vatican was a beacon of salvation, but for those inside its walls, it could be a labyrinth of politics, secrecy, and sin. Documents were forged, indulgences were sold, and rival factions plotted, sometimes with daggers, sometimes with poison, always with silence. This is not the story of medieval faith itself, but of the shadows that clung to it, a tale of the Vatican in the Middle Ages, where sanctity and sin lived side by side, and where the most sacred city on earth became a stage for some of the darkest secrets in history. Welcome to Scroll Historian. Here we unroll the forgotten pages of the past, stories of power, fear, and silence that history tried to hide. If you enjoy journeys into these hidden chapters, I invite you to subscribe, leave a like, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice helps keep history alive and ensures these stories reach others who seek to understand the shadows of the past. Now, let us begin. A city within a city. To understand the secrets of the medieval Vatican, we must first see it not as we do today, a small independent state enclosed within Rome, but as a fortress of influence that stretched across Europe. In the Middle Ages, the Vatican was not simply the seat of a spiritual leader, it was the headquarters of a vast system of power. The Pope was not just a religious figure, he was a monarch in his own right. The papal states, sprawling across central Italy, provided him with land, armies, and revenue. The Pope's palace in Rome rivaled those of kings, adorned with tapestries, precious relics, and treasures collected from across Christendom. While the faithful knelt in prayer, offering candles to saints, behind the walls of the Vatican, clerics administered laws, levied taxes, and commanded soldiers. The Church, outwardly humble in its message, was inwardly a state as complex and ambitious as any kingdom of its time. Wealth of the Holy See. The source of this power lay in wealth. Across Europe, from tiny villages to great cities, money flowed to the Vatican. Tithes, 1/10 of all income, were demanded from peasants, merchants, and nobles alike. Gifts of land and estates from kings seeking favor increased the Church's holdings. Pilgrims arriving at Rome brought offerings of gold and silver to the shrines of saints. But most lucrative of all were the indulgences, payments that promised remission of sins or time shortened in purgatory. To the faithful, they were an assurance of salvation. To the Vatican, they were a river of income. Bishops, priests, and cardinals used them to enrich themselves, often with the blessing of Rome itself. The Vatican's treasury became legendary, filled not only with relics and holy artifacts, but with gold from every corner of Europe. Yet the more wealth it accumulated, the more temptation it faced, and the more secrets it concealed. The Pope as a political king. With this wealth came power, and with power came ambition. Medieval popes did not simply bless kings, they rivaled them. They excommunicated rulers who defied them, declared crusades that redrew the map of the Mediterranean, and claimed the right to crown emperors. The Vatican became a place where politics and piety intertwined. Kings sent ambassadors to Rome, not only to seek spiritual approval but to secure political advantage. A favorable word from the Pope could legitimize a dynasty, his disfavor could doom it. Thus, the Vatican functioned as both a church and a throne. The papal tiara, triple-crowned, symbolized this fusion of roles: father of souls, ruler of kings, and judge of the world. In theory, this made the Pope the servant of God. In practice, it made him one of the most powerful monarchs in medieval Europe. The seeds of corruption. Yet absolute power rarely comes without cost. The Vatican's role as both holy guardian and worldly ruler created contradictions that could not be reconciled. Priests preached humility, yet cardinals dined in luxury. The Pope called for peace, yet waged war to defend the Papal States. The Church demanded purity, yet many within its walls lived lives of vice. The medieval Vatican became a place of dual faces: sanctity in the basilicas, sin in the chambers. Its wealth attracted greed, its power attracted ambition, and its secrets multiplied in the shadows. A kingdom unlike any other. By the dawn of the later Middle Ages, the Vatican was no longer simply the heart of Christendom. It was a kingdom in its own right. It had armies, diplomats, laws, spies, and prisons. It was feared by kings, courted by nobles, and obeyed by peasants. But this kingdom, cloaked in holiness, was vulnerable to hypocrisy. Behind its walls, ambition thrived, and in its halls, the dark secrets of the Middle Ages took root, secrets that would haunt the Church for centuries. The treasure of the Church. The wealth of the medieval Vatican was staggering. Gold chalices, jeweled reliquaries, silken vestments, illuminated manuscripts. Treasures collected not only for the glory of God, but as symbols of power. Cathedrals rose like mountains of stone across Europe, funded by offerings of the faithful and by the labor of peasants who gave a portion of their meager harvests to the Church. Inside the Vatican itself, this wealth was displayed in grandeur. The papal palace glittered with imported mosaics and rare stones, gifts from emperors and kings, relics of saints, the bones, the garments, even the drops of blood were enshrined in gold. For pilgrims, these were objects of devotion. For the Vatican, they were also commodities, drawing countless visitors who brought alms and offerings. But where wealth gathers, temptation follows, and behind the splendor of holy objects, greed began to spread like rot within the heart of the clergy. Indulgences and the sale of salvation. Perhaps the most infamous practice of the medieval Church was the sale of indulgences. In their original form, indulgences were meant as acts of mercy, a remission of penance granted to those who performed good deeds or went on crusades. But as centuries passed, they were transformed into a lucrative business. By the 13th and 14th centuries, indulgences could be purchased with money. A coin placed on the altar could shorten a soul's time in purgatory. A generous donation could free generations of ancestors from suffering. Priests preached salvation, but they sold it as though it were a merchant's wares. For the poor, this system was devastating. They gave what little they had, desperate to save their souls. For the wealthy, indulgences became a way to purchase forgiveness for sins committed without remorse. For the Vatican, it became an endless river of gold. Behind the altar, priests counted coins. Behind the curtain, cardinals argued over shares. And in Rome, the Pope reaped the benefits, filling the coffers of the Church with money meant for salvation. Simonia, holy offices for sale. Corruption reached beyond indulgences. Another dark practice spread through the Vatican: simony, the selling of holy offices. Bishops, abbots, and even cardinals could obtain their positions not through piety, but through bribes. Wealthy families paid enormous sums to secure seats of power for their sons, turning sacred offices into dynastic prizes. This practice filled the Church with men who cared little for the gospel but much for influence. Some bishops rarely visited their dioceses, preferring to stay in Rome where politics and wealth flourished. Monasteries, once havens of devotion, became estates of privilege for nobles. The very hierarchy of the Church, meant to guide the faithful, became entangled in transactions of gold. The Vatican's spiritual authority was weakened by its material hunger. The scandals of the clergy. With wealth and privilege came vice. Many clerics, despite vows of chastity and humility, lived openly in contradiction to their oaths. Chronicles tell of bishops keeping mistresses, cardinals raising illegitimate children, abbots dining in luxury while peasants starved outside monastery walls. Rome itself became notorious. Pilgrims who arrived in the city to kiss holy relics also saw streets filled with lavish feasts, drunken priests, and scandalous rumors about the papal court. The Vatican was both the heart of Christendom and a theater of hypocrisy. The faithful, though devoted, could not ignore these contradictions. They prayed in cathedrals, gave offerings, and confessed sins, yet they whispered about the sins of their confessors. Faith endured, but trust in the clergy began to erode. The darkness behind the altar. The paradox of the medieval Vatican lay in this. The very institution that promised salvation was itself consumed by sin. The altar glowed with candlelight, but in the shadows behind it, deals were made, indulgences sold, and power traded for gold. The people still saw the church as their guide to eternity, but for those inside its walls, eternity often mattered less than earthly pleasure. The Vatican of the Middle Ages was not only a holy city, it was also a court of corruption, where faith was entwined with greed and where secrets multiplied behind every curtain. The cloak of chastity. The medieval church demanded chastity from its priests, bishops, and popes. Celibacy was presented as the highest expression of spiritual purity, a sign that the clergy lived apart from earthly desires. From the pulpit, priests thundered against lust, condemning adultery, fornication, and impurity as sins that led souls to damnation. But behind the thick walls of the Vatican, reality was often very different. The very men who preached chastity sometimes broke their vows in secret, and in some cases in scandalously public ways. Celibacy was not only a spiritual burden, it was also a political tool. By enforcing it, the church ensured that its property and wealth would not be passed down to heirs. Yet for many clerics, the vow was a mask, one that could be set aside when shadows fell over the halls of Rome. Mistresses in the Vatican. Rumors of mistresses kept by bishops and even popes circulated widely during the Middle Ages. Chronicles whispered of cardinals with entire households of women, and of popes who fathered children while condemning others for far lesser sins. Some popes lived more like kings than saints. Their courts resembled those of monarchs, filled with feasts, entertainments, and companions not suited to the image of the shepherd of Christendom. In Rome, it was no secret, the same streets that hosted processions of relics also carried whispers of papal affairs. The faithful, though shocked, often tolerated what they suspected. For some, it was easier to believe that their leaders were holy despite their sins, rather than admit that corruption had reached the highest altar. Nepotism and illegitimate children. From these forbidden desires came another dark practice, nepotism. Popes who fathered illegitimate children found ways to secure them positions of power within the church. The very word nepotism comes from the Latin nepos, meaning nephew, a convenient label for sons born in scandal, later introduced into clerical ranks as if they were merely relatives. These nephews rose quickly, becoming bishops or cardinals despite their youth or lack of training. Thus, the private desires of popes reshaped the very structure of the church, turning sacred offices into dynastic tools. The Vatican became not only a palace of prayer but also a family estate, where influence was inherited as surely as wealth. Behind the sermons of chastity lay a hidden world of dynastic ambition secured through secret bloodlines. Rumors and reality. Not every story was true, yet the very persistence of these rumors reveals how the Vatican was perceived. Tales of papal lovers, secret children, and orgiastic feasts spread through Europe, sometimes exaggerated by enemies of Rome, sometimes whispered by those inside the city itself. Whether fact or rumor, the effect was the same. The Vatican's reputation grew darker. For peasants in faraway villages, the Pope remained a distant figure of authority. But for those who traveled to Rome, the contrast was clear: holiness on the altars, scandal in the shadows. The dual faces of the Vatican. In the end, the medieval Vatican lived with two faces. In public, it was the guardian of purity, condemning lust as one of the 7 deadly sins. In private, it was a court where desires were indulged and where vows were broken behind closed doors. This hypocrisy, more than the acts themselves, eroded trust. The faithful still believed, still prayed, still offered their coins, but deep in their hearts they began to question whether their shepherds were truly leading them to salvation or simply hiding their own sins under the cloak of sanctity. The Vatican as a battleground. The Vatican in the Middle Ages was not only a place of prayer, it was a fortress of intrigue. Within its walls, ambitions clashed as violently as armies outside. Cardinals, bishops, and noble families fought not with swords in open fields, but with whispers, bribes, and silent daggers in the night. To sit on the papal throne was to stand at the pinnacle of Christendom, but also to become a target. Every pope had rivals, and every rival had allies. Families like the Orsini and the Colonna treated the papacy not as a sacred office, but as a prize in their endless feuds. Behind solemn masses, plots were hatched. Behind prayers, poison was mixed. Assassinations in the Holy City. Assassination was not rare. Chronicles speak of clerics found dead under mysterious circumstances, of chalices tainted with poison, of meals that became the last supper for ambitious men. Popes themselves were not safe. Some died suddenly, their deaths attributed by whisper to secret enemies. The irony was cruel. The very city meant to be the heart of peace often pulsed with violence. Priests who preached against murder sometimes arranged it. Cardinals who prayed for mercy sometimes sharpened daggers in the dark. Rumors abounded of poisoned rings, cups laced with deadly powders, and sudden illnesses that struck down rivals at the most convenient moments. In the Vatican, survival often depended not only on faith but on caution at the dining table. Rival factions and bloody feuds. The power of the papacy attracted not only churchmen, but noble families. In medieval Rome, 2 clans in particular, the Orsini and the Colonna, turned the Vatican into their battlefield. Each sought to place their own candidates on the papal throne, bribing cardinals, threatening opponents, and using violence when persuasion failed. When one family lost influence, churches were sacked, monasteries burned, and clerics hunted in the streets. Rome itself bore the scars of these feuds, its holy spaces turned into arenas of bloodshed. The Pope, supposedly above politics, was often little more than the champion of whichever faction had won the last battle. The papal armies. To protect their power, popes themselves raised armies. The Vatican commanded not only prayers but soldiers. Papal troops marched through Italy, seizing lands, punishing rebels, and defending the papal states. What began as a spiritual kingdom had become a military power competing with dukes and kings. Some popes rode at the head of these armies, clad not in priestly robes but in armor. Their banners bore the cross, but their swords shed Christian blood as readily as any enemy's. For the faithful, this blurred the line between shepherd and warlord, between pope and prince. The Vatican's silent wars. Yet the most dangerous battles were not always fought with soldiers. They were fought in secret chambers, where rival cardinals gathered allies, forged alliances, and plotted coups. A single vote in a papal conclave could change the fate of Christendom, and so those votes were bought, threatened, or stolen. Poison, blackmail, and assassination were weapons as effective as armies. The Vatican was a court of constant tension, where trust was rare and betrayal common. Even the holiest prayers could not drown out the echoes of plots whispered in the dark. A holy city in shadow. Thus, the Vatican in the Middle Ages was a paradox. To the pilgrims who journeyed across Europe, it was the holy city where relics glowed and the Pope blessed the world. But to those who lived within its walls, it was a labyrinth of danger where ambition killed, where rivalries bled, and where the survival of a pope could never be taken for granted. Behind the incense and hymns, there was always the shadow of poison in the cup, the glint of a dagger under a robe, the knowledge that the most sacred throne in Christendom was also one of the most perilous. The allure of relics. In the Middle Ages, relics were more than sacred objects. They were keys to power. The bone of a saint, a fragment of the true cross, a vial of holy blood. Each promised miracles, protection, and divine favor. For the faithful, relics were windows into heaven. For the Vatican, they were also instruments of authority. Pilgrims came from every corner of Europe to gaze upon these treasures, bringing offerings that filled the coffers of the church. The possession of a relic could turn a minor chapel into a famous shrine, and the Vatican held some of the most revered of all. The more relics it guarded, the stronger its spiritual claim over Christendom. But in the shadows of reverence lurked deceit. Forgeries abounded. Multiple churches claimed to hold the same saint's bones, and some relics were crafted by clever hands rather than holy miracles. The faithful bowed before them nonetheless, while the Vatican kept silent, guarding its power even when truth was uncertain. Holy objects as political weapons. Relics were not merely for devotion, they were political tools. A pope could grant or deny access to them, offering them as gifts to kings or withholding them as punishment. In this way, the Vatican transformed faith into leverage. A fragment of a saint's garment could secure an alliance. The refusal to share a relic could insult a monarch. Even coronations of emperors were bound to relics. To be crowned in Rome, in the presence of sacred objects, was to receive legitimacy, not only from men but from God himself, and so relics became bargaining chips in the dangerous game of medieval politics. The Vault of Secrets. Beyond relics lay something even more mysterious: knowledge. The Vatican was not only a treasury of objects, but also of documents, ancient texts, decrees, forbidden writings. All were collected, copied, and locked away. Here lay the origins of the Vatican's most enduring myth, the secret archives. Though formally established later, the seeds of such collections were already present in the Middle Ages. Letters between kings and popes, reports of heresies, records of trials, and even manuscripts deemed too dangerous for ordinary eyes were hidden behind locked doors. This archive was not a library for the faithful, but a vault of power. To control knowledge was to control history. To conceal it was to shape the narrative of faith and authority. Forbidden knowledge. Whispers spread that the Vatican concealed more than political documents. Some believed it kept writings that contradicted accepted scripture, books of heretical sects, even texts of pagan wisdom preserved from antiquity. Whether true or not, the rumor alone gave the Vatican an aura of mystery. It became not only the guardian of faith, but also the gatekeeper of forbidden truth. What was hidden was as powerful as what was proclaimed, and in an age when knowledge was scarce, secrecy was the sharpest weapon of all. Shadows of control. Relics and archives together created an empire of silence. The faithful bowed before holy objects, never knowing whether they were genuine. Scholars debated theology, never realizing that documents locked away might have changed the story. Kings obeyed the Pope, never certain how much of his power rested on divine mandate and how much on secrets guarded in vaults. The Vatican's strength lay not only in armies or gold, but in what it concealed. What the world was not allowed to see gave it an authority even greater than what was shown. The Vatican's double legacy. Thus, in the Middle Ages, the Vatican stood as both shrine and vault, a place where relics drew pilgrims, and where secrets were guarded with iron keys. To the faithful, it was the center of holiness. To the powerful, it was a treasury of leverage. To history, it remains a labyrinth of mysteries, some revealed, many still hidden, the paradox of a holy city. In the Middle Ages, the Vatican was both the holiest place on earth and one of the most dangerous. Pilgrims arrived from distant lands, carrying hope in their hearts, kneeling before relics, believing that here, in this city, heaven touched the earth. But behind the basilicas, shadows gathered. The same walls that echoed with hymns also whispered with conspiracies. The same hands that raised the chalice sometimes mixed poison. The paradox defined the Vatican, outwardly sacred, inwardly political. Its leaders claimed to be shepherds, yet lived as kings. They demanded purity, yet practiced indulgence. They preached humility, yet hoarded gold. In this duality lay both its strength and its corruption. The weight of faith. Despite the scandals, the faith of the people endured. The peasant in a distant village still prayed to saints. The pilgrim still kissed relics. The noble still sought papal blessing. For them, the Vatican remained the center of their spiritual world, even if its walls concealed sins they would never see. This endurance of faith reveals something profound. The human need for hope is greater than the flaws of institutions. The people saw beyond the corruption, clinging to the belief that, even if men sinned, God's truth remained. And perhaps this was why the Vatican could survive its darkest hours, because the faith of millions outlasted the failings of a few. Shadows that echo through time. The dark secrets of the medieval Vatican did not vanish with the passing of centuries. They became part of its legacy. Whispers of corruption, lust and violence lingered, shaping how the world saw Rome. The Renaissance popes, the Reformation critics, the modern skeptics all inherited this memory of a church that was as human as it was divine. The secret archives, the relics, the stories of forbidden love and deadly poison, they became legends, fueling imaginations for generations. The Vatican's holiness was never erased, but neither were its shadows. The lesson of dual faces. Perhaps the true lesson of the medieval Vatican is that power and sanctity rarely live apart. Where power gathers, so does ambition. Where holiness is proclaimed, temptation follows. The Vatican was both, a place where the highest ideals of faith met the lowest instincts of man. It reminds us that institutions, no matter how sacred, are shaped by human hands, and humans are never free of weakness. The Vatican's story is not only a tale of sin, but of survival, a city that endured its scandals, carried its shadows, and still stood as the heart of Christendom. Closing reflection. As we close this scroll, we see the Vatican of the Middle Ages, not as a single face, but as two: the shining face of faith, where pilgrims found comfort, and the shadowed face of power, where ambition and secrecy thrived. Its basilicas glowed with candlelight, its relics inspired awe, but its chambers echoed with whispers of sin. It was holy, and it was corrupt. It was eternal, and it was fragile. The medieval Vatican remains a symbol of humanity itself, striving toward heaven, yet bound to the earth. Sanctity and sin, side by side, written into history. And so the scroll closes on the Vatican of the Middle Ages, a place where holiness and corruption walked side by side, where relics inspired faith even as whispers of poison and scandal spread in the shadows. If this story has given you something to reflect upon, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. What do you believe was the true face of the medieval Vatican, a beacon of faith or a fortress of power? If you found meaning in this journey, a simple like helps these forgotten tales reach others. And if you wish to walk again through the hidden corridors of history, subscribe so together we may continue to unroll the scrolls of the past. Until the next story, thank you for watching, Scroll Historian.